Well, howdy folks, Stan the Human here, and this is Sunset Ceremony. So grab your drink and get your hors d'oeuvres on, and let's get ourselves into chapter 2 of this incredible tale we've been reading here called Knight in the Rusty Armor. And so last night in chapter 1 we kind of learned the story of how this guy got caught in his armor. And this is chapter 2, in Merlin's Woods. It was no easy task to find the wily wizard. There were many woods to search, but only one Merlin. So the poor knight rode on day after day, night after night, becoming weaker and weaker. As he rode through the woods alone, the knight realized there were many things he didn't know. He'd always thought of himself as very smart, but he didn't feel very smart at all trying to survive in the woods. Reluctantly, he admitted to himself that he didn't even know the poisonous berries from the edible ones. This made eating a game of Russian roulette. Drinking was no less hazardous. The knight tried sticking his head into a stream, but his helmet filled up with water. Twice he almost drowned. As if this weren't bad enough, he had been lost since entering the woods. The knight couldn't tell north from south or east from west. Fortunately, his horse could. After months of searching in vain, the knight was quite discouraged. He still hadn't found Merlin, even though he'd traveled many leagues. What made him feel worse was the fact that he didn't even know how far a league was. One morning, he woke up feeling weaker than usual and a little peculiar. That was the morning he found Merlin. The knight recognized the magician at once. He was sitting under a tree, clothed in a long white robe. Animals of the forest were gathered around him, and birds were perched on his shoulders and arms. The knight shook his head glumly from side to side. His armor squeaking as he did. How could all these animals find Merlin so easily when it was so hard for me? Warily, the knight climbed down from his horse. "I've been looking for you," he said to the magician. "I've been lost for months." "All your life," corrected Merlin, biting off a piece of carrot and sharing it with the nearest rabbit. The knight stiffened. "I didn't come all this way to be insulted." "Perhaps you've always taken the truth to be an insult," said Merlin, sharing the carrot with some of the other animals. The knight didn't much like this remark either, but he was too weak from hunger and thirst to climb back on his horse and ride away. Instead, he dropped his metal-encased body onto the grass. Merlin looked at him compassionately. "You are most fortunate," he commented. "You're too weak to run." "What does that mean?" snapped the knight. Merlin smiled in reply. "A person cannot run and also learn. He must stay in one place for a while." "I'm going to stay only long enough to learn how to get out of this armor," said the knight. "When you learn that," said Merlin, "you will never again have to climb on your horse and ride off in all directions." The knight was too tired to question this. Somehow he felt comforted and fell promptly asleep. When the knight awakened, he saw Merlin and the animals all around him. He tried to sit up, but he was too weak. Merlin held out a silver cup with a strange-colored liquid in it. "Drink this," he ordered. "What is it?" asked the knight, eyeing the cup suspiciously. "You are so afraid," said Merlin. "Afraid? You're so afraid," said Merlin. "Of course, that is why you put on the armor in the first place." The knight didn't bother to deny this, for he was too thirsty. "All right, I'll drink it. Pour it into my visor." "I will not," Merlin said. "It is too precious to waste." He plucked a reed, put one end in the cup, and slipped the other into one of the holes in the knight's visor. "This is a great idea," said the knight. "I call it a straw," replied Merlin. "Why?" "Why not?" The knight shrugged and sipped the liquid through the reed. The first sip seemed bitter, the later ones more pleasant, and the last swallows quite delicious. Grateful, the knight handed the cup back to Merlin. "You should put that stuff on the market. You could sell flagons of it." Merlin just smiled. "What is it?" asked the knight. "Life," Merlin replied. "Life?" "Yeah," said the wise magician. "Did it not first seem bitter? Then as you tasted more of it, was it not pleasant?" The knight nodded. "Yes, and the last swallows were quite delicious." "Well, that was when you began to accept what you were drinking." "Are you saying that life is good when you accept it?" asked the knight. "Is it not?" replied Merlin, raising an eyebrow in amusement. Do you expect me to accept all this heavy armor?" "Ah," said Merlin. "You were not born with that armor. You put it on yourself. Have you ever asked yourself why?" "Why not?" retorted the knight irritably. At this point, his head was beginning to hurt. He wasn't used to thinking in this manner. "You'll be able to think more clearly when you regain your strength," Merlin said. With that, the magician clapped his hands, and the squirrels, holding nuts in their little mouths, lined up in front of the knight. Each squirrel climbed up onto the knight's shoulder, cracked and chewed a nut, then pushed the pieces through the knight's visor. The rabbits did the same thing with carrots, and the deer crushed nuts and berries for the knight to eat. This method of feeding would never be endorsed by the health department, but what else could a knight do who was stuck in his armor in the woods? The animals fed the knight regularly, and Merlin gave him large cups of life to drink through the straw. Slowly, the knight grew stronger and began to feel more hopeful. Each day, he asked Merlin the same question. "When will I get out of this armor?" Each day, Merlin replied, "Patience. You've been wearing that armor for a long time. You cannot get out of it just like that." One night, the animals and the knight were listening to the magician play the latest troubadour hits on his lute. Waiting until Merlin had finished playing "Hark ye, the days of old, when knights were bold and maidens were cold," the knight asked a question long on his mind. "Were you really the teacher of King Arthur?" The magician's face lit up. "Yeah, I taught Arthur," he said. "But how can you still be alive? Arthur lived eons ago," exclaimed the knight. "Past, present, future are all one when you're connected to the source," replied Merlin. What is the source? Asked the knight. It is the mysterious and invisible power that is the origin of it all. I, I, I don't understand, said the knight. That is because you are trying to understand with your mind, but your mind is limited. I have a very good mind, argued the knight. And a clever one, added Merlin. It trapped you in all that armor. The knight could not refute this. Then he remembered something that Merlin had said to him when he first arrived. You you once said that I put on this armor because I was afraid. Is that not true? Responded Merlin. No, I wore it for protection when I went to battle. And you were afraid you would be seriously hurt or killed, added Merlin. Isn't everybody? Merlin shook his head. Whoever said you had to go to battle? I had to prove that I was a good, kind, and loving knight. If you really were good, kind, and loving, then why did you have to prove it? Merlin asked. The knight escaped, thinking about this in his usual manner of escaping things. He drifted off to sleep. The following morning, he awakened with an odd thought stuck in his head. Was it possible that he was not good and kind and loving? He decided to ask Merlin, what do you think? What do you think? Merlin replied. Why do you always answer a question with a question? And why do you always seek the answers to your questions from others? The knight stomped off angrily, cursing Merlin under his breath. That Merlin, he muttered. Sometimes it really gets under my armor. With a thud, the knight plunked his burdened body down under a tree to contemplate the magician's questions. What did he think? Could it be that, he said aloud to no one in particular, that I'm not good, kind, and loving? Could be, said a little voice. Otherwise, why are you sitting on my tail? Huh? The knight peered down to the side and noticed a little squirrel sitting beside him. That is, he could see most of the squirrel. Her tail was hidden from sight. Excuse me, said the knight. said the knight, quickly moving his legs so that the squirrel could reclaim her tail. I hope I didn't hurt you. I can't see very well in this visor in my way, you know. I don't doubt that, replied the squirrel without any resentment in her voice. That's why you have to keep apologizing to people for hurting them. The only thing that irritates me more than a smart-aleck magician is a smart-aleck squirrel, groused the knight. I don't have to stay here and talk to you. He labored against the armor's weight in an attempt to get to his feet. Suddenly, in amazement, he blurted out, Hey, you and I are talking! A tribute to my good nature, replied the squirrel, considering that you sat on my tail. But animals can't talk, said the knight. Oh, sure we can, said the squirrel. It's just that people don't listen. The knight shook his head in bewilderment. You've talked to me before? Certainly. Every time I cracked a nut and pushed it through your visor. How can I hear you now when I couldn't hear you then? I admire an inquiring mind, commented the squirrel. Don't you ever accept anything the way it is, just because it is. You're answering my questions with questions tonight. You've been around Merlin too long. And you haven't been around him long enough. The squirrel flicked her tail at the knight and ran up a tree. The knight called after her. But, wait, what's your name? Squirrel, she replied very simply and vanished into the topmost branches. Dazed, the knight shook his head. Had he imagined this? At that moment, he saw Merlin approaching. Merlin, he said, I have to get out of here. I've started talking to squirrels. Splendid, replied the magician. The knight looked troubled. Oh, what do you mean, splendid? Just that. You're becoming sensitive enough to feel the vibrations of others. The knight was obviously confused, so Merlin continued explaining. You didn't talk to the squirrel in the woods, but you felt her vibrations, and you translated those vibrations into words. I'm looking forward to the day when you start talking to flowers. That'll be the day you plant them on my grave. I have to get out of these woods. Where would you go? Back to Juliet and Christopher. They've been alone far too long. I have to get back and take care of them. How can you take care of them when you cannot even take care of yourself? Merlin asked. But I miss them, whined the knight. I want to go back to them in the worst way. And that is exactly how you will be going back if you go back in your armor, cautioned Merlin. The knight looked at Merlin sadly. I don't want to wait until I get the armor off. I want to go back now and be a good, kind and loving husband to Juliet and a great father to Christopher. Merlin nodded in understanding. He told the knight that going back to give of himself was a lovely gift. However, a gift, to be a gift, has to be accepted. Otherwise, it lies like a burden between people. You mean they might not want me back? Asked the knight in surprise. Surely, they would give me another chance. I mean, after all, I am one of the top knights in the kingdom. Perhaps that armor is thicker than it appears, Merlin said gently. The knight thought about this. He remembered Juliet's endless complaints about his going off to battle so often, about the attention he showered on his armor, and about his closed visor and his habit of abruptly going to sleep to shut out her words. Maybe Juliet wouldn't want him back, but certainly Christopher would. Why not send Christopher a note and ask him? Suggested Merlin. The knight agreed that this was a good idea, but how could he get the note to Christopher? Merlin pointed to the pigeon sitting at his shoulder. Rebecca will take it. The knight was puzzled. But she doesn't know where I live. She's only a stupid bird. Well, I can tell north from south and east from west, snapped Rebecca, which is more than I can say for you. The knight quickly apologized. He was thoroughly shaken, not only that he had talked to both a pigeon and a squirrel, but he'd gotten both of them mad at him the same day. Big-hearted bird that she was, Rebecca accepted the knight's apology and flew off with his hastily written note to Christopher in her beak. Don't coo at any strange pigeons or you'll drop my note, the knight called after her. Rebecca ignored his thoughtless remark, realizing the knight had much to learn. A week passed, and Rebecca still had not returned. The knight became more and more anxious, fearing she might have fallen prey to one of the hunting falcons he and the other knights had trained. He winced, wondering how he could have participated in such a foul sport. Then once again, an awful pun. When Merlin finished playing his lute and singing, "You'll have a long, cold winter if you have a short, cold heart," the knight expressed his worries about Rebecca. Merlin reassured the knight by making it a happy little verse. "Smartest pigeon who ever flew will never wind up in someone's stew." All at once, a great chattering arose from the animals. They were all looking skyward, so Merlin and the knight looked too. High above them, circling for a landing, they saw Rebecca. The knight struggled to his feet just as Rebecca swooped down onto Merlin's shoulder. Taking the note from her beak, the magician glanced at it and gravely told the knight it was from Christopher. Let me see," said the knight, eagerly seizing the paper. His jaw dropped with a clank as he stared at the note in disbelief. It's blank," he exclaimed. What does that mean?" "It means," said Merlin softly, "that your son does not know enough about you to give you an answer." The knight stood there for a moment, stunned, then groaned and slowly sank to the ground. He tried to choke back the tears, for knights in shining armor simply don't cry. However, his grief soon overwhelmed him. Then, exhausted and half drowned from the tears in his helmet, the knight fell asleep. Tomorrow, Chapter 3, The Path to Truth, as we continue Robert Fisher's The Knight in Rusty Armor. I'm Stan the Human. I hope you enjoyed this sunset video. I love you, and I am out of here.